Hello, everybody. This is Earth, We Can Do This, a brand new podcast sponsored and brought to you by contactsforless.ca. Now, briefly, let me talk about who I am. I'm Paul W. Slusher, owner and founder and CEO of contactsforless.ca. And the reason why contactsforless.ca is even sponsoring a podcast at all is because contactsforless.ca is focused on the idea of giving 51% of its net profits to saving the planet. So if you live in Canada, I'm sorry, US and everybody else in the world, but if you're in Canada, you can order your contact lenses online, save a ton of money, and you will we will give away over half of our net profits to the nonprofit that you choose. Okay, so that's very unique, but this podcast is not about selling that product or selling that brand. This podcast is going to be focused and is focused on taking a new topic every bi-weekly. We're going to do it every 2 weeks. And in these podcasts, I'm going to talk a lot about the subject matter. And the focus, as the title says, is to attempt to be positive. Earth, we can do this. We can do this. We can change and fix everything that's going on in this world. We can make this a better place. We really can. And I don't want to make this just another one of those positive speech sort of, hey, yay, go team. No, this is going to be a lot more practical discussions and talks about what's really going on, the statistics, the data, the information, and what's realistic. What can we really do? And what can't we do? Now, the topic we're doing today reflects the group of the month on our website at contactsforless.ca. Also, briefly, let me comment that this podcast will be available in video format on Facebook and on YouTube, the YouTube channel for Contacts for Less, as well as on the contactsforless.ca blog. We'll have a video embedded there as well for you to watch and to check out. For those of you listening just on podcast, we hope you enjoy this. You won't get to see, there won't be a lot of visuals in the video, so you're not missing a much. But I really do encourage everybody to give me feedback, not only on what I'm talking about and how I'm presenting the information, but your take on the subject matter. Today is going to be about prisoners, and what are we going to do about this huge segment of our population that ends up in jail and ends up honestly, in a cycle of poverty and violence and drug addiction and maybe even mental illness. I'm going to go into all of that here in a little bit. And it's, unfortunately, in most cases, there's a lot of positive sides to every topic. In this one, maybe a little less so. So this isn't going to be the most positive podcast, but it's certainly, I am going to try very hard to talk directly about what can be done, because things can absolutely get done. And I'm going to be very specific about what we're talking about here. Okay. But first, as I'm going to do in every episode, and for those of you watching on video, you're going to see I'm putting my glasses on now. One of the things we're going to talk about here is I'm going to go over some news related to the topic. And so this is some brief stuff. I just want to touch base on it. A couple of, and they're interesting because they create the foreground for the talk that I'm going to give over the next 50 some odd more minutes. Just recently, the BBC released some very interesting information about prisoners released by mistake. This isn't a big part of what we're going to talk about today, but I still found it interesting. Apparently, UK has sort of run into an interesting problem where one of their largest problems they keep running into is they keep accidentally releasing prisoners. I think that's very interesting to counterpose that or contrast that with the United States, Canada being a lot more like UK, a lot more of a sensitive system, a lot more of a compassionate prison system. United States would never release people by mistake. That almost never happens. In fact, they don't release people they should release. So I found it interesting that the UK actually has an issue with releasing people accidentally. It completely differs from what you see in the United States, which I'm going to talk a lot about the US, but I'm also going to talk a lot about Canada. Another bit in the news was interesting. This was just recently, July 27th, 2017. And I'll just read the first part of it. This was from CNN. An Oklahoma sheriff and 5 other people have been indicted in the death of a prisoner who was held in restraint chair for more than 48 hours without adequate food, water, or medical care. The prisoner was Anthony Huff, 58, of Enid, Oklahoma. He was arrested June 4th, 2016, on a charge of public intoxication and was held in the Garfield County Jail, according to a news release from Oklahoma Attorney General Mike Hunter. Okay, so essentially what happened here is they brought this guy in, and I guess he had a history of alcoholism and maybe even mental illness. That's not necessarily clear here, but he became irate and uncontrollable, which is okay. Fair enough. You have to restrain this guy. I understand that. But in doing so, they violated a whole set of principles and policies. One of them was that they're supposed to check on the prisoner every 15 minutes, which they absolutely failed to do. They restrained him and did not check his prior history at all. But I think what's most interesting is they gave him inadequate food, water, or medical care at all. This is point. You got to say the United States, what is this? The lighthouse of democracy of the world, supposedly, and yet time and time again, you see the United States being caught up in stories in which not just police brutality, police killing prisoners, really in situations that are very questionable at best, but then really like. In this case here, Facebook is just filled with video of people getting beat for no reason, and I've seen some horrible things on Facebook and that have been posted or live leak. But this particular case in Oklahoma, this guy comes in with public intoxication charges and ends up dying within 24 hours. It's really, really quite amazing. Now, in this rare case, it doesn't happen very often. These particular officers or officials were charged with, I think it's second-degree manslaughter charges for some of them. Yeah, second-degree manslaughter charges for a number of them. We'll see how much of that sticks. To be honest with you, there's going to be a jury trial. Juries have a tendency to err on the side of police and prison officials over prisoners, no matter what, and white people over non-white people. So chances of these people really going to jail, we'll see. I'll be curious. I'll keep you up to date if I hear more about this. I'm going to bet that there isn't going to be much to these charges in the end, but we'll see. I hope that those charges stick if they really did what this article says. But again, that's the U.S. for you. Now, the other one, this is a very interesting article that I found on truth-out.org. And it was just a small piece, but it talks about the internationalization of U.S. Prison systems and structures. I don't know if many of you are probably not familiar with Honduras, which had a illegal, well, we'll call it an illegal, it depends on whose laws you're following, an illegal coup. And the United States has been cooperating with this very, very right-wing, very military and oppressive government in Honduras for quite a bit of time. And what they've been doing is basically exporting U.S.-style prisons there. Now, you could say, well, gosh, the U.S. prison system must be wonderful, then it must be the best one because it's the United States. Au contraire. In fact, very interesting. Here's a quote from one of a guy named Gary Mejia, who was incarcerated in a prison called El Pozo. El Pozo is that's its name, or I guess it's its nickname for this prison in Santa Barbara, Honduras. And his quote was, listen to this quote. "There is no water. For example, to bathe, I have to take water out of the trash can with the same glass I drink water out of. The food is terrible. All of us are getting skinnier all the time. Imagine that you were only taken out to see the sun for 5 minutes a day, and then we're isolated without being able to see our loved ones." And then the article goes on to say, extreme isolation, being locked in tiny cells and sun deprived are not unusual conditions in prisons in the U.S. By the way, first of all, did you catch that? Being locked in tiny cells with sun deprivation are not unusual conditions in prisons in the U.S. Oh my God, are you kidding me? But are new to Honduras prisons. This is really quite amazing. So even the country like Honduras, which is run by a right-wing dictatorship, essentially, a very, very hardcore right-wing government that is absolutely unwilling to give in to any kind of progressiveness at all, and yet its prisons were better than the way U.S. treats it. But now, of course, they're exporting U.S. type of prisons to Honduras. Yay for Honduras. So there's that subject. Okay. Now, getting away from the news a little bit, I'm going to talk, but okay, for a second here, we're at the 10-minute mark. So I just want to briefly remind listeners that this podcast is brought to you by contactsforless.ca, where you buy contact lenses in Canada, and you save a tremendous amount of money, and you get to give 51% of our net profits to the nonprofit that you choose. There are 53 nonprofits on the website. And I am Paul W. Slusher, owner, founder, and CEO of Contacts for Less. And thank you for listening to this really brand new and evolving podcast. Your feedback is always welcome. If you wish to send feedback to me here directly, one of the ways you can do it is you can write an email to podcast@contactsforless.ca. You can also just go to contactsforless.ca and do the contact us button and write us a message. And also if it's on YouTube or Facebook, you can leave your messages there and we'll see them. And as best I can, I will reply. If you love the podcast, great. Let me know. If you didn't, let me know. If you disagreed, let me know. If you agreed, whatever it is, whatever you want to say, I want this to be a conversation. Yes, I'm talking to you and at you, but I want you to feel comfortable hearing what I have to say, listening to it, pondering it, and saying, I don't agree with this guy at all, or, oh yeah, absolutely, I 100% agree, and I want to tell him I do. So let's do that, and I will actually each week, if there are comments that are, how do I put it? Quality comments that we can bring on the air that aren't just swearing or getting mad or whatever it is, and I'm going to try to bring them on the air and share them with people the next week. Okay, so I'm going to go into something else here before we get any further. Here's a few statistics, just a few to chew on. This is really some amazing stuff. The United States has 5% of the world's population, 5%, but 25% of the world's prisoners. The total incarcerated population in the U.S. is a staggering 2.4 million. Now, actually, I have some other stats that show a little bit different number, 2.2 or 2.119 million, but essentially it's over 2 million. That's a 500% increase over the last 30 years. 1 in every 108 adults in the United States was in prison or in jail in 2012. Okay, are you hearing this? 1 in 28 American children has a parent behind bars. Okay, now let's stop for a second. I'm a father, and I have a beautiful little daughter, and I can't even fathom what my daughter would go through if I were in prison, and how she would see society, and how that would change the way she sees herself, how she sees herself in her level of empowerment. Especially if I went to jail for something petty, like a lot of people have, like drug possession or something like that, and I'm going to jail for years and years and years for something that I really should be on probation for, or it should be a minimal sentence. And I'm going to get into the whole sentencing thing a little bit later here. So let me continue. At the end of 2007, 1 in 31 adults were behind bars, on probation or on parole. Currently, and I think this was done 2 or 3 years ago, currently 65 million Americans have a criminal record. 65 million Americans. What's the American population? 270 million or something? That's insane. The U.S. spent $80 billion on incarceration in 2010 alone in 1 year. $80 billion. Now imagine if they just took 10 billion of that and built some more schools and a rehab center here and there. What would that do to the prison population? We're going to get into solutions down the road, but okay, I don't want to depress you here. This particular podcast is not meant to make you sad or angry, it's really to get all this information out so we understand what we're talking about here, what we're dealing with. A first-time drug offense carries a sentence of 5 to 10 years. In other developed countries, that sentence would be 6 months of jail time on average. 5 to 10 years versus 6 months. Insane. In the 1990s, marijuana possession accounted for nearly 80% spikes of the spike in arrests. 3 out of 4. Listen to this one. I used to live in Washington, D.C. years ago. 3 out of 4 young black men in Washington, D.C. can expect to serve time behind bars. Okay, I just have to hesitate and go, are you, really? This is nuts. African Americans comprised 12% of regular drug users, but almost 40% of those arrested for drug offenses. More than 96% of convictions in the federal system result from guilty pleas rather than decisions by juries. And one of the reasons why that is, it's not that they're guilty, it's that if they fight it and lose, it's worse for them. This is, Vice did this amazing piece on this. I would urge you to Google this. An amazing piece on this about how people are literally pleading guilty just so that they only go to jail for 2 years versus 5 if they try to fight it. But they are actually innocent. It's insane. Conservative estimates put innocent people who plead guilty between 2 and 5%. I've actually heard numbers much higher than that, which translates to tens of thousands of innocent people behind bars today. And what you really don't hear, I'm talking about the U.S. anyway, of them trying to deal with this problem. Now I'm going to get to Canada for those of you who are in Canada, which I live in Canada, and thank God I do. I love Canada. I mean, I love the U.S. too. I'm a dual citizen, but I cry for the United States in a lot of ways. I mean, not only Trump as president, but this data here is just so damning. It's unbelievable. And the last one I'll bring on here, a public defender will routinely have a caseload of more than 100 clients at a time. I went to law school. I didn't practice law, but one of the things that I can comprehend is if you had 100 clients at a time and they're rotating at a fast pace, how in the world are you ever going to deal with their interests? You're going to tell them, look, just plead guilty, okay? Plead guilty. You'll go to jail for 1 year versus 5, and everything's going to be fine. Just plead guilty. Get them, really, move on. It's like a conveyor belt of prisoners. Okay, last little bit of data. According to BBC News, released this just recently, 2.193 million prisoners in the United States in jail. That's 737 people out of 100,000. That's in the United States. In China, it's 1.5 million, which makes it 118 per 100,000. And in Russia, it's 615 per 100,000. So they have a very large percentage, but still the total amount of population, 874,000. So that means that if you add China and Russia together, all of their prisoners total in the whole country, it just barely beats the United States. Those two huge countries with huge populations actually have a prison population, just slightly above the United States. And if you took the next, 15 countries on this list and added them all up, they wouldn't even come close to 2.1 billion. And these are countries like Brazil, India, Mexico, Ukraine, South Africa, Poland, England, Wales, Japan, Kenya, Turkey, on and on. I mean, okay, all right. So I've clearly laid the groundwork for a discussion that the United States is absolutely out of control in terms of imprisoning its own population. Now, I'm going to get into why in a minute, or what I think is why. And of course, if you're listening, send your emails in, send your feedback in. I'd like to hear what you have to say about this. So I'm going to go into a little bit of Canada. Canada is on a whole nother level here. Canada, a lot like UK and other more sane Western nations, does not imprison at a massive rate. In fact, according to Statistics Canada, the adult incarceration rate remains stable. That means it's not growing, and yet the population is growing. So that means actually, essentially, it's either staying the same per capita or even maybe slightly reducing over time. Canada has a relatively sane population. We also don't have this Second Amendment argument that allows us to carry guns everywhere and shoot everybody. So there are arguments why serious violent crime is not happening in Canada versus the United States. But it could also be argued it's a cultural thing, that Canadians are just more peaceful, more compassionate, maybe more civil, arguably perhaps even more evolved. It's hard to say. I'm not saying U.S. is unevolved. I'm just saying, look at the data. I mean, the data does speak for itself. Now, again, economic inequality in the United States is a major serious issue, and that may have a lot more to do with this, and levels of mental illness on the street may have a lot more to do with why the United States is more out of control than Canada. Canada has a better social safety net structure, has a better medical system, which allows people to get in mental health earlier and easier without cost, allows people to get physical treatment by doctors and specialists much easier. In the United States, being poor, being mentally ill, having your teeth fall out, if you can't afford to go to a dentist, you can't afford to go to a doctor, you have to go to an emergency room. They're not going to treat you long term. I mean, this isn't going to be good for anybody's psyche. So you're certainly going to have populations where people are going to be more upset, more angry, more frustrated. And of course, you have super, super wealthy in the United States. So you have these super poor, super wealthy, and the super poor look at the wealthy and they feel anger. They feel detached. They feel like they're not part of society. They're not respected. And it could be argued that they're not. In Canada, we still have rich and poor, but we treat our poor differently. We treat our homeless differently. And in the UK, they do the same. They're a lot more compassionate. And because of the healthcare systems of France, England, and United States and Canada and other parts of Europe, that level of compassion shows even those people the most angry and the most frustrated that there's a heart to the government. There's a heart to the people. In the United States, no, it's a get down on your knees and shut up and do as you're told and go to prison and throw away the key. At least that's my impression of it. If you have a different impression, please give us your feedback. So I'm going to go on just a few things about Canada. I thought this was very interesting. You know what a remand is? And I'll read what the actual definition of it so you understand. A remand is the placement of a defendant on bail or in custody, especially when a trial is adjourned. Okay? So a remand essentially is waiting for trial or something's going on in between trial. In Canada, remand exceeds sentenced populations. That means there's more people in jail short term, just dealing with trial and going from procedure to procedure, than the actual people in jail. That is not the case in the United States. It's actually quite amazing. So Canada is doing quite well. Now, I'm not saying that Canada's not perfect. Canada's perfect. It's not. I mean, Canada has some work to do as well. And the group of the month, a segue to contactsforless.ca, is that the group of the month at contactsforless.ca, the group that is the default group when you buy and we give away our profits. If you don't pick another nonprofit to give our 51% of our net profits to, then the group that's going to go to by default is the West Coast Prison Justice Society. Now, let me just read what they're about, because this really shows you how Canada and Canadian nonprofits handle of the issue in Canada. We're very focused here in Canada, even the nonprofits, on giving rights and respect to prisoners. So let me just read this one paragraph. This is from West Coast Prison Justice Society. We assist with issues that affect prisoners' liberty rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, such as solitary confinement, involuntary transfers, parole suspensions, disciplinary hearings, and more. We also assist prisoners with human rights and healthcare issues, ensuring that their right to be free from discrimination on the basis of race, nationality, ethnic origin, color, religion, age, sex, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, marital status, family status, and mental or physical disability, and that those are respected. This is, a great group, and we very much are glad they're on the website, and that's why they're there, and that's why they're the group of the month, because this is a topic. This is a population, a very growing and large population in all society, particularly U.S., but in Canada too, that we need to take care of. And why? It's been said that the quality of the way you can gauge a society is the way it treats its weakest or its sickest or its most disabled or its most incapable or incapacitated individuals. A society that throws away its bottom 10%, like you kind of see in the United States, is a sign that the United States is more interested in the top 10% and the top 30% and the top 40% and that upper middle class and even its middle class and its interest in corporate America and wealth and power and global dominance and a lot of these aspects. In Canada, this is not a part of the dialogue. The dialogue is more about taking care of the bottom and everybody else as well. That's why universal health care is in Canada and why it's one of the best in the world. Okay, so essentially, when we talk about prisoners and we talk about prisons, what we're talking about is more than just crime and punishment. We're talking about the reaction by citizens who live in a society in which they are either being treated with respect, even if they are like, a drug dealer on the street or a prostitute or whatever, still being treated like a human being. Whereas if you don't treat that person as a human being and you toss them in jail, the only result you're going to get, really, and the statistics show this, recidivism in the United States for this type of punishment is horrible. The amount of people that come back to jail is dramatic. And this is true. And I'm about to get into some statistics. I want to get into this briefly. That, for example, and so I have some data here, juveniles make up a very large amount of prisoners in the United States, whereas what they used to do is they used to have more of a home prison type, homes environments like halfway home type structure where juveniles would go and try to readjust to this issue they're dealing with, get some mental health help and all that. Now they're just really being incarcerated. I'm talking about the United States again. The other thing that's very interesting is we've already talked about the Black community and the Latino community. In fact, there's some information in this particular document I'm looking at. This is really quite dramatic. In 2010, these are 2010 statistics, okay? The white population, 64% of the population are white or what's called non-Hispanic, okay? But they make up 39% of the prison population, okay? So 64 versus 39. And that's 450 people for every 100,000 white persons, I guess. Hispanics or Latinos, okay, make up 16% of the U.S. population, and they represent 19% of the U.S. Incarcerated population. So a slight jump, but up. So again, before we get to the black community, the white community goes from 64 in the population down to 39 in prison. Hispanics, 16 goes up to 19. Oh boy, when we get to African Americans or black Americans, what you're running into is 13% of the population and 40% of incarcerated individuals. That's 2,306 people for every 100,000. It's insane. I think I read somewhere that 1 in every 5 black men will, in some way or another, be impacted by the criminal justice system. I mean, directly, not like their father goes to jail. I mean, they will have an interaction with it. 1 in 5. Okay, I don't have that data here for sure, but I'm just telling you that is shocking. And one other thing I want to throw at you is this information I have about transgender. And let me jump to that really quickly. And I'm just going to read this straight from Wikipedia. Transgender adults and LGBT youth are disproportionately more likely than the general population to come into contact with the criminal justice system. According to the National Center for Transgender Equality, 16% of transgender adults have been in prison and/or jail, compared to 2.7% of all adults. That's like 5.2% or five times, more than 5 times, almost 6 times more. And why is this? It goes on to say, the reasons behind these disproportionate numbers are multifaceted and complex. Poverty, homelessness, profiling by law enforcement, and imprisonment are disproportionately experienced by transgender and gender non-conforming people. This often results in LGBT youth running away and/or engaging in criminal activities such as the drug trade, sex work, and/or theft, which places them at a higher risk for arrest. Because of discriminatory practices and limited access to resources, transgender adults are also more likely to engage in criminal activities to be able to pay for housing, healthcare, and other basic needs. Now, let's just take a moment here. If they were in Canada, even though there may still be tremendous amount, I'll say Canada does a phenomenal job, Canadians do a phenomenal job of being respectful to not only those of different cultures and different religions, but of their orientation. But if these particular individuals were in Canada, they wouldn't have to steal to get healthcare. They wouldn't have to steal to go get some basic dental care. They may even be able to get some housing taken care of or helped through either EI or some other program. United States, you're on your own, buddy. So really, again, it's amazing. This whole podcast is not going to be, not the entire series. The series of podcasts are not going to be all about how much better Canada is than the United States. There are many topics we plan to go on, and there are some issues that Canada really absolutely needs to address, especially in some of the environmental issues. But this being said, on this particular topic, there's no question that the United States is the example of what you don't want to do, and Canada is an example of at least moving in the right direction. Okay, so we're going to move on from this. I want to tell you one other quick thing, and this is something you may even want to Google. A gentleman named Levi Belknap, that's Levi Belknap. He wrote a short little piece about going to jail, and it really caught my eye, and I want to share it with you. I'm going to read just little bits of it, but he went to jail. I'll start out with this. Daddy, why are you going to prison? Aren't the bad guys in prison? My 5-year-old son was afraid. I'm going to help the guys in prison, buddy. They aren't bad guys. They're just people who've made mistakes. So he's talking to his son about what he's going to try to do in jail for this kid, for these people that are in jail. And he had these beliefs going in about what was going on in jail, like a lot of people do. Well, a couple of things that he addresses here. Before going to prison, my beliefs about prisons and prisoners were based on stereotypes and lies. Here's what I believed about prisons before visiting. Prisoners are dangerous. Prisoners are mean. Good guys like me don't go to prison. I was wrong. And he goes on to talk about all the people that he meets when he's in prison. And he's talking about people that have been there for 20 or 30 years. And he says these men had committed serious crimes in their late teens and early 20s and were still paying the price in their 40s and 50s. I'm sure some of these men were dangerous when they were put in prison, but they didn't seem very dangerous to me now. Most of these men had grown up in poverty, surrounded by gangs and violence, and had done bad things. But mean is not the way I would describe them. Humble, kind, gentle, thoughtful, friendly, and respectful are the words I would use to describe the men I met in prison. And then he goes on to talk about this one particular case of a guy he calls a lot like himself, a white, college-educated, middle-class American with 2 loving parents who didn't grow up around gangs and violence. And he told the story that he had been driving drunk, and I think that something occurs. It doesn't make that clear here. Something happens, and he went to prison as a result. Either he was driving, or he had an accident, or something like that. But he goes to prison, and he doesn't see himself as a bad guy. But you see, that's the thing. In prison, it's not all bad guys. And that's the one thing that we need to remember. There are a tremendous amount of people that are good people you might even know. Well, unfortunately, you don't know them very long when they go to jail, particularly in the United States, because you're not going to have contact with them. So if you kind of knew them and they disappear, what happened to Joe? Oh, he went to prison. Oh, he went to prison. Oh, okay. Well, I'm not going to deal with that guy anymore. So there's a real culture, a bias against people who've been to jail. And at the end of the day, there are a lot of people that should go to jail because they got a lot of issues and we need to separate them from society. There's no doubt about that. But when they're in jail, we've got to remember they're still human beings. And if we care about our planet, if we care about creating a better world for our children and even for ourselves right now, the first step is treating every human being as a human being. I know that's hard when you hear about a rapist or a murderer. I understand that. It is very difficult to see that. And that's one of the reasons why the death penalty is such an attractive option for people who pay attention to these things, because he did this terrible thing and want him to die. Well, again, I don't think this is hard for people to understand. I know Canadians get it. I'm not sure how many Americans understand this. If the state says don't kill, but then the state kills, how in the world can the state actually argue thou shalt not kill? I'm not a religious person, but of course the Bible says thou shalt not kill. And yet, even within the Bible, there's killing in the name of God. So, and religious texts do this all the time. So perhaps the basis of government looking at the issue of, well, we shouldn't kill, but we'll kill when it's justified. I guess this may be the logic. It may have its roots in religious background and culture and history, which makes it all the more sad, because the logic of it just escapes me. And I think it escapes most people who really look at it. The other thing is, to be perfectly honest, if you committed a heinous crime and you're going to go to jail for the rest of your life or, be put to death, to be perfectly honest, I think most people, when asked, if you had a choice between spending the rest of your life behind bars with a very limited amount of exposure to things other than, you get to read and maybe meditate and learn how to change yourself, maybe, or you're just going to rot in jail versus dying, I think some people would say, you know what, just kill me now. So really, I'm not sure we're really doing anything other than exacting revenge. I'm not really sure we're accomplishing anything other than committing more acts of violence and rationalizing it with this crazy idea that somehow it's okay to kill because the state did it. So, again, this comes back to the way we deal with penal policy in general, and especially the United States. When crimes happen, we want them to suffer. We want them to feel pain. And I don't disagree with the idea that a child molester or a rapist or a murderer should suffer on some level. Absolutely. That's why they're going to jail. I'm not sure we're necessarily going to even rehab a mass murderer or a child rapist, or I don't know. I'm not an expert in rehabbing prisoners. But what I do know is this. When you put a bunch of very violent criminals in a room, and then you take a bunch of other people that aren't violent criminals and put them in that same room, the chances of you doing and exacting enormous damage on everybody in the room is like 100%. That's going to happen for sure, So then why are we putting people that are non-violent criminals, people that are in there for drug possession or maybe fraud or they wrote bad checks or they theft or, but they didn't hurt anybody, they didn't kill anybody. Why are we putting them in the same rooms with people that want to murder and kill and rape and torture? And when we do this, what do we expect? What are we expecting? Are we expecting the person who has been, really a pretty good person? They didn't do any really damage to anybody. Maybe they stole a TV and got caught. Okay. And they went to jail. Next thing you know, they're standing next to a guy who took a 6-year-old and raped and killed him. Are you kidding me? What's going to happen there? Is that going to do anything for the guy who's not really, I'm going to tell you a story. As a friend of a friend, When he was a pot dealer, and I think he was moving pot, or he had to have some weed on him, and he got busted. Now, this guy was the most kindest, gentle guy. I mean, he was selling weed, but he believed in his mind that weed was a gift from God, and that it should be shared. And now maybe he's a rare case of the type prisoner, but anyway, he gets busted. This is basically a hippie, mellow guy, loving, peaceful, nonviolent, goes to jail. Under the laws in the United States, very firm sentencing for people who go to jail for that kind of thing. So he went to jail, and he was sitting in a state penitentiary with people who were violent criminals, rapists, and murderers. This guy came out of jail angry, pissed off, and ready to do damage. He went from nice guy to major problem in society. Now, someone could say, well, he went to jail, he did his time, so, you did the crime, you do the time. Okay, fair enough. But if you're going to do it that way, why are you throwing this guy under the bus? Why don't you have a separate prison for guys like him, where they're not going to kill each other and rape each other and try to do damage to each other and influence them and create so much anger, do solitary confinement? I mean, listen, at the end of the day, what are we doing here? Come on, what are we trying to accomplish? Are we trying to accomplish punishment? Okay, yeah, to some degree we are. I think actually we can all agree that there's a punishment component to prison, and it should be there. Are we trying to isolate them from society because they're dangerous to us, or we consider them so? Yes, I think we can all agree on that. But are we trying to make sure that every single person who goes to jail comes out really seriously messed up? Because if we're trying to accomplish that, unfortunately, we're achieving that. And there are far too many cases of good, kind people who made some stupid mistakes, or maybe made some mistakes that weren't so stupid. They were just doing, they were being selfish and maybe greedy and evil, but they are trying to change themselves in prison. And it's very difficult to do so when there's no resources, no support, and a structure that is essentially going to leave them hanging to the point where they're going to come out and feel like, well, what are my options now? People hate me. I went to prison. They're going to judge me as a jerk. They're going to judge me as a person. I'm going to have to, what am I going to wash dishes? I'm going to take the trash out for somebody. I'm going to clean grease pits in a restaurant. Those are my choices? Hell no. I'm going to go sell some weed again. I'm going to go sell some drugs again. Maybe I'll go rob a house, because I'm not doing this anymore. We're setting people up for that. It's a setup for failure. Now, I know many of you are listening to this. You know this already. So you're thinking, so what? So what are we going to do about this? Okay, we're going to get into that in a second. So anyway, I wanted to bring up Levi Belknap's article. I think it's very, very cool what he goes into. And he talks, basically his thing at the end was, in prison, you can change yourself. And that's one of the things that prisoners try to do all the time. And this is really, I think, where the solution is. Change is always possible. And as far as I'm concerned, there's never a point. Okay, let's put it this way. Maybe 5, 10, 12% of the population, maybe not even that, maybe 2% of the population is so far gone with its violent behavior, its desire to hurt others, the rapists, the molesters, this sort of thing. When I was in grad school many, many years ago, I met a guy. I really don't want to mention his name, and I don't the details I'm going to keep away from. But there was a guy that I knew. He was a friend of my girlfriend's. And this guy seemed like a really nice guy. I can say his first name, because it's for the purposes of the story. His name is Brian. Whether that's his real name or not, you'll never know. But he was this guy who, he seemed like such a nice guy. He had a really cool Japanese girlfriend, and lived together, and they lived near the campus where I was going to school, and they were really good friends with my girlfriend. And I felt as if, this is a guy I could befriend. I used to hang out with him, and I'll admit, back while I was smoking a lot more weed. I was in grad school. I was smoking weed. I shouldn't have been, but I was smoking weed with this guy periodically and enjoying a beer or two here and there. And then there was this one day where he turned to me and he told me a story about how his brother and his other brothers, 2 older brothers, used to, tease him and bully him. And I was like, well, that's really harsh. I think it's pretty common. And he goes, well, my situation isn't that common. They would rape me. And I was totally, what? And he said, yeah. And my father would watch. I was just like, okay, I didn't even know what to say. And I just felt nothing but sadness for this guy. And I said, oh my God, that is horrible. So I don't remember the whole conversation after that. I just remember being completely blown away. I went home with my girlfriend at the time and I said, did you know that Brian had been raped by his brothers and his father used to watch? And she said, no, he never told me that before. Maybe he was just trying to freak you out. I said, no, I don't think so. I think he meant this story. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, a few weeks later, a few months later, I don't know how long it was, all of a sudden I find out he's in jail. And why is he in jail? So I go over to the house. We were kind of good friends with this couple. So we go over to the house and we talk to the girlfriend. And she says, well, I'm going to give him a phone call and we're going to talk. Maybe you can ask him yourself. So I got on the phone with this guy and I said, Brian, what did you do? And he said, and he tried to tell me this story. He tried to rationalize this story about how he didn't mean any harm. He was babysitting some young girls. I don't know how he got that job or, we all kind of know probably now why he went to try to get a job like that. He was fondling sexually some young girls. And I don't know the details. I didn't really want to know, to be honest with you. It was insanely shocking. And I said to him, Brian, seriously, man, are you kidding me? What did you do? You fondled, what are you thinking? And then he reminded me of the story of being raped by his brothers. And I said, that's not a rationalization. Look, I'm sorry that happened to you, but that is not okay. That is just not okay. And he said, and I'll never forget these words. He said, I think I should just kill myself because I've tried many times to stop thinking about molesting children. And I can never get it out of my head. And I don't think I'll ever change. Well, anyway, needless to say, I never had contact with him again, and I never would again. And I completely walked away from that experience shocked. And it was a big wake-up call for me on some level. I had never even heard of such a thing. I'd never seen such a thing. It was one of the most shocking things up to that point in my life that I had ever seen or dealt with. And I didn't tell people I was even afraid to just even mention this, that I knew anybody like this, because strangely enough, just by telling somebody, like telling you that I even knew a person who did this, there's this vibration that people give you that's like, oh my God, you actually knew them? Well, no, I didn't go out to try to find the guy I just happened to know him because of a situation and, et cetera and so on. But I mean, that's how intensely intense we take this, and we should. Child molestation is absolutely a freaking horrible thing, and there's absolutely nothing positive you could possibly glean out of that. And I'm not sure Brian is ever going to be rehabbed. So I tell that story for the purposes of explaining that there are some people, for whatever reason, wrong or right, sad or not, that they may never ever recover from their condition, their desire to do harm or to manipulate or to oppress another human being. That's just sad reality. And those individuals need to be put somewhere away from society for the rest of their lives. Unfortunately, I don't give Brian any chance at rehab. And I think there are many, many, many people like him. Okay. So absolutely they need to go somewhere. But what really baffles me is that we are putting in those same prisons with those Brians, the banker who got caught stealing from the bank, the grocery clerk who maybe couldn't pay his rent, so he took a gun and he robbed somebody at gunpoint in a park. I mean, these are not good either. But the point is, should you put those two people together? You're not going to get anywhere doing that. I've already talked about this early in the hour. And so let's talk about what solutions we can do. So we talked about all the things that are going wrong. We've talked about all the things that are screwed up about the U.S. population or prison population, which is like as easy as pie to see. I mean, there's no question about it. Overpopulation of prisons and the lack of funding. And this brings up an issue. So let's talk about solutions now. Okay. One of the things that I want to talk about is, what are we going to do? Okay. So first of all, before I go any further on this ultra positive topic today, I want to remind you that this podcast is being brought to you by contactsforless.ca, where you get to save money on contact lenses and save the planet. And we are all about, and I'm Paul W. Slusher, owner, founder, and CEO of contactsforless.ca. And we are all about giving 51% of our net profits to the nonprofit that you choose to try to help our amazing planet. Okay, so Now, the plug is over. Let's move on. So what do we do about prisons? All right. So first of all, funding. Now, one of the reasons why prisons are so crowded is because societies don't want to pay for prisons. Okay, much like we saw in British Columbia when there was a transit bill. I know I'm not equating prisons with transit, but it's the concept. BC needs transit like as bad as anybody, but people voted against it because oftentimes people vote against their own interest. Donald Trump won an election in the United States, and he is absolutely not in anybody's best interest except for maybe an elite few billionaires. So at the end of the day, you're going to find that people are going to vote against their interests, and they're going to vote for what fills their pocketbook as opposed to what they care about emotionally or any level of compassion. I'm not saying everybody. A lot of people, like Bernie Sanders was very popular in the United States, and he represented quite a progressive position. I think Bernie Sanders is an amazing candidate. It's unfortunate that he didn't have an opportunity based on the circumstances, but for sure, he's the kind of guy that represents people who represent the interest of people. Maybe not the billionaires, but the people. So how are you going to represent the people when it comes to prisons? Well, first of all, if you're a voter in the United States or Canada or anywhere, you absolutely need to make sure that you're voting in favor of funding prisons and rehab for prisons. Private prisons, on the other hand, now that's a whole other story. I could spend a whole hour on private prisons, which I'm not going to do. But there's no question private prisons, privatization of prisons is a very dangerous topic because you're trying to take profit from the process. So that means for every, say, $1 million that comes into the system for prisons, somebody who owns that prison wants to take $100,000 out of it to pay themselves a profit. When you have state-run prisons, you're going to not ever have that problem because nobody's trying to pull a profit out of it. Okay? So private prisons is just insanity to start with, and it shouldn't even be on the table. But of course, in the United States and in foreign countries where the United States is pushing its agenda, absolutely you're seeing privatization of prisons. So let's get back to funding prisons. So we've got to fund prisons in a couple of different ways. First of all, I think we really need to look at the idea that violent offenders need to be completely separated from nonviolent. That is not happening now because of money. That needs to happen. Why? Because you have a very large populated, the violent population is less than half. It depends on each country. I believe it ranges between 20 and 30%. So that means 60, 70% of them are drug offenders or theft or something else. They're not violent. So they should be, first of all, that needs to be separated. Violent versus nonviolent, they need to be in separate prisons because you don't need that influence. Number one. Number two, you need to create more space. There was a study done on rats. It was a long time ago, so I may get this wrong a bit, but you put a few rats in a large environment and you allow them to breed. And as those rats breed and there's more rats in the space, eventually they start to turn on each other. And I remember that it was a horrible experiment. It was horrible to watch on video, but eventually the rats became diseased because they were killing and eating each other. There were so many, and they were competing for space and food and water. And eventually they all died. Now that should be a profound metaphor to what prisons are like in the United States and other places in the world. Canada, not so much, but certainly we need to create as much space as possible around each prisoner. I know you don't want to make it a vacation experience, and I understand why people react to that. I don't want it to be it's not supposed to be a party. I understand that position, and I agree with you. But it doesn't make sense to make them suffer to the point where when they come out, they are absolutely the worst possible person ever. That also doesn't serve you and I interests, the people that do abide by the law. For those of us who work hard to improve society, we're not benefiting. See, that's the thing. What I think voters forget is that they think they're voting in their interest. But when you vote against something like transit, you're voting against your interest. When you vote against something like prisons and having more prison space and having more prison space for per person and more rehab programs, more education, etc. for these prisoners, you're voting against your interest. Do you know why? Because when they come out, your tax dollars go to spending money on police, rearresting them, getting them back in jail, putting public defenders on them, putting them back in prison, and the victims that they create. So there's all these horrible, horrible circumstances that are coming out of this, and it's all because we're not really trying to fix them. We just want them over there. Put them over there. Leave them over there. So that's the first part. Also, and I had the numbers, but I'm not going to go through more stats. You're probably sick of stats at this point. It has been estimated that anywhere between 15 and 40% or more of prisoners are mentally ill. In fact, in some cases, it's much higher. Okay, it really is all over the map. But there are so many prisoners who are potentially mentally ill. Now, okay, so if you've got a mentally ill patient, what do you want to do? I think the hardcore guy is going to say, well, throw him in jail anyway. So what? He committed a crime. I agree with you. But put him in a penal system that will address his mental illness. One of the issues that One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that wonderful movie, addressed was that institutionalized mental illness facilities were actually abusing people, not helping them. So there's a fear, I think, amongst us to create institutional mental illness facilities. I understand that. But and again, the way we run prisoners in the U.S., if you put more mental health facilities, you're just going to have a terrible scenario. I can see the fear there. But we've got to address this issue because the mentally ill are back on the streets all the time and they're going to recommit all the time. They're just going to keep going. If you have a homeless person who's an alcoholic, a violent, who has PTSD, maybe he's a vet, this guy's not going to go out on the street and suddenly just want to go and get a job at a bank. It's not going to happen, or almost never going to happen. I don't want to ever say never because I do believe in people. I believe that they have the spirit to change. But this is not something that's going to happen. So we've got to look at scenarios in which we can make it work for everybody. And that includes us, those who pay taxes and do abide by the law. I want prisoners to come out and I don't want to be worried about them committing crimes again. That's my interest. I want my daughter to walk down the street and think, well, that guy who crossed the street, that guy over there I'm seeing, that guy went to jail. But you see, he went to jail and was treated well, like a good person. Like, he was a prisoner, but he was treated like a human being. And that means he's not walking around with a chip on his shoulder and wants to hurt somebody because he's so pissed off, he's poor and he has no opportunity in life. If that guy has no opportunity in life, you know what he's going to do? He's probably going to steal from me. I don't want that, nor should you. So we've got to fund our prisons. Also, we need to spend more money on rehab, drug rehabilitation, and education. This costs money, people. You don't get something for nothing. If you want to have a society where we have a peaceful world, we've got to create peacefulness in prisons. And this goes down to another whole idea. If you allow violence to just fester in prisons, you're only festering negative, violent energy that will permeate everybody in the prison and it will come outside of the prison. So what you've got to do is when you have violence, you've got to immediately separate it and isolate it and you got to deal with it. Yes, that means that some people who are profoundly violent may end up alone or in small we'll call them groups in a prison where they're only around other violent people. Yes, and there may be violence among them. That's unfortunate. But if they're going to be violent and aggressive and try to commit murder on other human beings, they've got to be separated. And yes, there's going to be some people that just are not going to get better. But we're talking about the other 70% of the population. That's what we're trying to deal with, the other 80%, whatever it is. And maybe even 5 to 10% of those really violent people, maybe there's still hope for them too if you showed them love. If you showed them respect, if you showed them that they had a choice. They had a choice. A lot of people commit crimes because they feel like they have no choice. And this is something that if you talk to anybody who's ever committed crimes, not everybody, but I've met a lot of people who've committed petty crimes in different times in my life. And the common theme is, I needed to do it. I needed the money. I needed to do this. It wasn't, I just decided to rob somebody because I was bored. I didn't meet hardly anybody in my life who's ever said anything like that. So, and I think also outside influence can have a lot to do with it. And I want to say one more thing quickly about the death penalty because we're getting up on our hour here and I'm just about to wrap up here. But it is shocking to me that the state penal structure of the United States and any state would put somebody to death. I know people do heinous things, but how in the world can you make the argument? How in the world can you possibly make the argument that we respect life, that we want to prevent murder, and that murder is wrong? And then we go, yeah, but you know what? We're going to kill some people too. And it's because we want revenge. Okay, so we're saying two things at one time. You know what? You criminal can't commit crimes or do violence because you want revenge, because that's wrong. But the state gets to do it. Why does the state get to do it? The state gets to do it because it has all power. When the state acts like a hypocrite like that, what does that tell you? What does that say to the bottom 10% of the most aggressive and angry? What do they think? They think, you know what? Screw that. I'm taking that on. I hate the state. This is why people don't trust their governments sometimes. And this is why they want to do damage to their governments and they want to commit acts against governments and large corporations. Well, corporations is a whole other thing. But positions people of power. They want to take them out. They want to do damage to them. Why? Because they see them as the enemy. Why? Because they promote a system of hypocrisy. Okay, so you know what? I'm coming on. We're at 55 minutes. I think it's about time that we wrap this up. I briefly want to remind you that you're listening to the new podcast, Earth, We Can Do This. I'm Paul W. Slusher, owner, founder, and CEO of contactsforless.ca here in Canada. If you are in Canada, please go to contactsforless.ca and buy your contact lenses with us. We give away 51% of our net profits to save the planet, and you get to decide where. And in the month of August, well, actually, this podcast may be being listened to past August, but in the month of August 2017, at that time, if you're listening to this during the month of August, the group of the month is the West Coast Prison Justice Society, who works with prisoners to protect their rights and to try to treat them humanely, to try to work in the way that we all should work, which is we should all love each other as much as we can. You can't love the worst people in society. It's hard to. That's probably the biggest lesson in life, is that you're gonna be mad and dislike certain people. That's just the way it is. And some people are gonna be mean and vicious, and that's the way it is. But if you can find a way to at least show compassion, at minimum show compassion, you've gone a long way to making the world a better place. And so, Earth, we can do this. We can do this. We can improve the prison justice system in Canada, even though it's pretty good now. We can make it better. We can make it so that when people come out of jail, they feel like they were treated well and they had a chance at a new future. This is the key, one of the many keys to saving our planet. I'm Paul W. Slusher. For Earth, we can do this. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, if you're watching on video. And have a wonderful month, a wonderful year, and a wonderful life. Take care.